Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
What steps would you take to troubleshoot an EC2 instance that does not appear as a managed instance in the AWS Systems Manager console?
I would first verify that the Systems Manager agent is installed and running on the instance. Additionally, I would check that the AWS Application Discovery agent is configured.
How would you implement CI/CD using AWS Code Pipeline for a company that has specific requirements like automated testing and approval stages?
I would use AWS Code Build to run unit tests and security scans. Then I would set up an Amazon Event Bridge rule to send SNS alerts to developers if any tests fail. I would also write AWS Cloud Development Kit constructs for different features, using a manifest file to turn features on and off. Lastly, I would include a manual approval stage in the pipeline for the lead developer's approval before deployment.
What solution would you recommend for a global e-commerce company needing scalable storage for legacy on-premises file applications?
I would recommend provisioning an AWS Storage Gateway file gateway in cache mode and deploying AWS Backup to take point-in-time copies of the volumes.
How would you design a solution for an application that needs to encrypt and decrypt data across AWS regions using AWS Key Management Service?
I would create a KMS multi-region primary key and use it to create a KMS multi-region replica key in each region where the application is running. Then I would update the application code to use the specific replica key in each region.
What would you do to resolve the issue of EC2 instances being terminated due to health check failures after adding a large amount of content to an S3 bucket?
I would change the health check path for the application load balancer.
How would you go about migrating on-premises Oracle databases to AWS while maintaining some on-premises databases for compliance?
I would launch Amazon EC2 instances to host the Oracle databases and place them in an auto-scaling group. Then, I would use AWS Application Migration Service to move the data from on-premises to the EC2 instances and set up real-time bidirectional change data capture synchronization. Additionally, I would utilize Oracle's native spatial data support and create an AWS Lambda function for maintenance jobs as part of an AWS Step Functions workflow, along with an Internet gateway for foreign table support.
How would you resolve the issue of a failed deletion of an old CloudFormation stack that involves temporary data in S3?
I would create a Lambda function to delete objects from the S3 bucket and add this function as a custom resource in the CloudFormation stack, using a depends-on attribute that points to the S3 bucket resource.
How would you optimize the S3 costs for an application that stores user-uploaded videos, considering their access patterns?
I would create an S3 lifecycle configuration to expire incomplete multi-part uploads after 7 days and transition objects to S3 standard infrequent access after 180 days.
What solution would you recommend for optimizing an e-commerce web application on AWS that is facing SQL injection attempts and increased order processing time during peak usage?
I would recommend using Lambda functions with provisioned concurrency for compute during peak periods, transitioning to Amazon Aurora Serverless for the database, and using CloudFront along with AWS Shield Advanced for protection against SQL injection and web exploit attempts.
How would you decrease application latency when launching new instances in an auto-scaling group for a web application?
I would use a dynamic scaling policy, enable warm pools for the auto-scaling group, and use lifecycle hooks to run the user data script.
How would you migrate a blog platform to AWS while ensuring that content updates are not delayed?
I would configure an Amazon Elastic Block Store multi-attach volume for the EC2 instances to share for content access and write code to synchronize it with the NAS server weekly. Additionally, I would mount an Amazon Elastic file system to the on-premises servers, copy the blog data to the EFS file system, and then mount it to the EC2 instances to serve the content.
How would you migrate a legacy Java web application running on Apache Tomcat and PostgreSQL to AWS with the least operational overhead?
I would use AWS Elastic Beanstalk to deploy the Tomcat servers with auto-scaling across multiple availability zones, store the application data in Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL, and implement Amazon CloudFront along with an application load balancer to manage increased traffic.
How would you migrate an on-premises IoT platform to AWS while reducing operational overhead?
I would create AWS step functions with AWS Lambda tasks to prepare the reports and write them to Amazon S3. Additionally, I would create an AWS Lambda function to connect to the IoT devices, process the data, and store it. Finally, I would configure an Amazon Elastic Kubernetes Service cluster with Amazon EC2 instances to prepare the reports.
How can a company manage costs and usage for an Amazon API Gateway API shared with an external team?
The most cost-effective solution would be to create an API Gateway API key and a usage plan. You can define throttling limits and quotas in the usage plan, associate it with the production stage and the API key, then share the API key with the external development team.
How would you ensure that an entertainment company's ticketing service always uses the most current pricing information?
I would create an AWS Lambda function to update an Amazon DynamoDB table with new prices whenever the pricing file is updated. Then I would update the ticketing service to retrieve pricing from DynamoDB.
How can you allow QA testers to launch their own environments without granting them broad permissions?
I would create an AWS Service Catalog product from the environment template, add a launch constraint with the existing role, and give users in the QA department permission to use AWS Service Catalog APIs only.
How would you replicate an entire application stack in a second AWS region for disaster recovery and growth?
I would create an AWS CloudFormation template for the current infrastructure design, using parameters for key system values, and then use that template to set up the new infrastructure in the second region. I would also update the existing DynamoDB table by enabling DynamoDB streams and adding the second region to create a global table. Additionally, I would create a new DynamoDB table, enable DynamoDB streams for it, and then copy the data from the existing table as a one-time operation.
What steps would you take to ensure that data scientists only access their own documents in an Amazon S3 bucket?
I would create a custom IAM Identity Center permission set to give them access to an S3 bucket prefix that matches their username tag, and I would use a policy to limit access to paths with the appropriate condition. Additionally, I would configure AWS CloudTrail to log S3 data events and deliver those logs to an S3 bucket, allowing us to use Amazon Athena to generate access reports.
How would you refactor a data processing application hosted on Amazon EC2 to eliminate the instances running the containers?
I would create an Amazon Elastic Container Service cluster and configure the processing to run as AWS Fargate tasks. I would update and containerize the container selection logic to run as a Fargate service, which starts the appropriate task. Lastly, I would set up an EFS event notification to invoke the Fargate service when new files are added to the EFS file system.
How would you migrate a large repository of digital news videos to AWS while minimizing management overhead and disruption?
I would set up an AWS storage gateway with a file gateway appliance on-premises. Then I'd use the media asset management solution to extract the videos and push them into the file gateway. I would build a collection in Amazon Rekognition using the catalog of faces and create an AWS Lambda function to have Rekognition pull the video from Amazon S3, retrieve the metadata, and push it back into the MAM solution.
What strategy would you recommend for a company looking to optimize costs for their AWS environment with multiple accounts?
I would recommend purchasing a 3-year EC2 instance savings plan with no upfront payment in the management account to cover EC2 costs across all regions, along with a 3-year compute savings plan with no upfront payment to cover any additional compute costs.
How can a company improve the performance and reliability of its static content distribution platform while minimizing latency?
The company can create an AWS Lambda function to track client routing to different regions and use AWS Private Link along with AWS Direct Connect to connect to a multi-region access point.
What steps would you recommend for a company migrating its VMware VMs to the AWS Cloud quickly, while also handling a large shared Windows folder?
I would suggest using VM import and export to create images of each VM. Then I would use AWS Application Migration Service to manage and view those images. For the shared files, I would copy the data to an Amazon Elastic file system and remap the file share to the EFS after migration.
How can a company with multiple AWS accounts store and query account activity from a central location using CQL?
The best solution is to use a delegated administrator account to create an AWS CloudTrail Lake data store, specify management events, enable the data store for all accounts in the organization, and then query the data in CloudTrail Lake.
How would you implement user authorization for a web application using a third-party identity provider with AWS API Gateway?
I would integrate the third-party identity provider with API Gateway, configure a Lambda authorizer to validate the tokens, require the authorizer on all API routes, and update the web application to get tokens from the identity provider to include in the authorization header when calling the API.
How can a company automate the encryption of its unencrypted Amazon EBS volumes and prevent the creation of new unencrypted volumes?
The solution involves configuring the AWS config managed rule to identify unencrypted EBS volumes and setting up an automatic remediation action. This includes associating an AWS Systems Manager automation runbook to create a new encrypted EBS volume, along with creating a customer-managed key in AWS Key Management Service. The key policy should include a statement to deny the creation of unencrypted EBS volumes.
How would you notify the development team when the Fargate tasks reach 80% of the maximum allowed?
I would use Amazon CloudWatch to monitor service quotas published under the AWS Usage Metric namespace. Then, I'd set an alarm for when the metric divided by the service quota multiplied by 100 is greater than 80 and notify the team using Amazon Simple Notification Service.
How would you handle patching of EC2 instances in an application account that needs to access Systems Manager and S3 without internet access?
I would create VPC endpoints for Systems Manager and Amazon S3, remove the NAT gateway from the VPC in the application account, and establish a VPC peering connection to access the patch source repository EC2 instances in the core account. Then, I would update the route tables in both accounts.
How would you enable logging for a web application using Amazon's simple email service to troubleshoot email delivery issues?
I would create an Amazon SES configuration set with Amazon Data Firehose as the destination and send logs to an Amazon S3 bucket. Then I would use Amazon Athena to query the logs in the S3 bucket for recipient, subject, and time sent.
How would you design a cost-effective solution for an application hosted on AWS that experiences slow responses during peak times?
I would create an auto-scaling group and attach it to the target group of the network load balancer. I would set the minimum capacity to 4 and the maximum capacity to 28, and purchase reserved instances for 4 instances.
How would you provide access for data scientists in a separate AWS account to an Amazon S3 data lake?
I would create an S3 access point in the data scientist's AWS account for the data lake and update the EC2 instance role to include a policy that allows the S3.getObjectAction with a valid access point ARN condition.
How can the company optimize costs for its ticketing platform on AWS while maintaining availability?
The company can create a gateway VPC endpoint for the S3 bucket to reduce data transfer costs, and also create on-demand capacity reservations for the instance type needed during the scheduled scaling periods.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.